Hi, everyone. This is Jim Clemmer. Welcome to our webcast, Leading a Peak Performance Culture. Delighted to have you join us here this afternoon. And we will be skipping over the icebergs fairly quickly over the next hour as we look at why this is the critical X factor in organizational effectiveness. Now, I will admit to some bias on this one. I've been working in the field of culture and leadership development for 30 years now, and it's very clear from my own experience and what I hope to prove over the next hour with the latest research is that culture truly boosts or blocks strategy, structure, and change initiatives. In fact, I think it's well summarized by Luke Gerstner, who was the architect of the major turnaround at IBM that happened throughout the 90s, where they really moved from becoming a hardware company to a software consulting company, a complete transformation. And when Lou wrote his book, Looking Back, on teaching that elephant to dance, he said, well, he always thought of culture as being one of other elements that go into organizational effectiveness with vision, marketing, financial strategy, etc. And his experience very much proved to him that culture isn't just one aspect of the game, it is the game. So let's take a look at what we'll be covering as we really look at how culture is the game and what we can be doing about it. We're going to talk a little bit about defining exactly what it is and some hard evidence for those soft skills with a look at some of the classic evidence, but more importantly, the most recent evidence, a fair bit of it just published this year. We'll take a look then at what is it that trips up many culture change efforts or change efforts of any sort. I call them the fatal 5 failure factors. So we'll look at those, and then we'll build off of that to look at, so what do we do to avoid those traps? What are the pathways or the steps we need to take that make for successful cultural transformation and the experiences that we've had with both successful and unsuccessful ones? So we'll then move further into what the key steps are to implementation and where we go from here. Now, because we do have nearly 900 people registered and joining us in this call, we won't be able to take questions throughout the call, but we will be pulling together any questions that you have into an FAQ kind of email, follow-up email or blog, or at the end of this broadcast, I'll be talking about next steps and how we will be able to give you a chance to ask more questions and be more directly involved. So let's move on to how we find hard evidence for soft skills, but first of all, defining what that soft element of culture really is, because it's a word like leadership, quality, a number of other words along that it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of people. So here's some definitions of culture from some of the researchers. An older one going back to Edgar Schein's work, who was at MIT, where he talks about culture being a pattern of shared basic assumptions that is learned and that is taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think, and feel. So that's one view of culture. Another view of culture is a more recent book I'll be quoting from further, is James Heskett's newest book, just came out about a month or two ago, called The Culture Cycle. And in it, he talks about the collective story that the group tells itself that drives the thinking, that drives behavior. And storytelling, metaphors, how we talk to each other is a key element of culture. He goes on to then boil it down to saying, well, it's really a shared set of assumptions, values, beliefs, behaviors, and artifacts. Artifacts being the symbols or the more visible manifestations of an organization's culture. And he adds 2 other important elements to this, because ultimately what gets measured gets managed. And what we act on is ultimately the sharp end of the culture. That's what really determines what our culture is. So as we've looked over the years at all of these definitions, and as we've worked at culture in a wide variety of ways, first in my previous company, the Achieve Group, way back when we did some work with Tom Peters around the excellence process in the 80s and into the 90s. We worked with Firing on All Cylinders, one of my earlier books that had to do with service and quality improvement, the whole TQM, CQI movement that's now all part of Lean. And then throughout the last 15 years at the Clemmer Group, we've worked quite extensively in Canada and around the world helping organizations with culture transformation. So as we look back and reflect on all of that, which is part of what I'm trying to do in this webcast, is to bring you a condensed version of everything, basically culture in an hour. And so we look back and well, I'll give you in a second the kind of definition that we see that comes out of that. But it is a complex concept, and that's certainly what we've found. But ultimately, it is about the norms, behaviors, values, and what is it that we feel is important. And it should get down to the group level or the peer level, which is what John Cotter talks about here, that when you have individuals, frontline people particularly, who are working together, they are ultimately the showcase for the culture. So looking at all that, our definition of this complex concept is that culture is really the way we do things around here. Well, that's fairly commonly been talked about as culture. So that could be in a family, it could be in a team, it could be an organization. Mom and dad sit here, and our team gets together, and here's what we talk about in our meetings. And so it starts to become some of the rituals and the way we do things around here. But I think an important element to add to this definition is especially when the boss isn't around. So how do people behave when nobody is around that's potentially snoopervising or trying to watch over how people are performing? So how do we treat each other? How do we treat our customers? Where do we put our priorities? What behavior do we consider to be acceptable or desired? What behavior do we consider to be unacceptable? What will get you shunned by the group or perhaps even fired by the organization? All of those things are manifestations of the culture. So looking then at the impact of culture, here's where there's a growing amount of research. There's some good classic research that's been around for years, some of it going way back to the times of the excellence work in the 80s and having been updated further with Jim Collins' work with Good to Great, Built to Last into the 90s. In fact, about 20 years ago, we saw some work from Cotter and Heskett, which we want to touch on in a moment. But before we get into the really hard evidence, I'd like to look at, from the standpoint of one of the poster children, I guess, for strong, effective cultures is considered to be Southwest Airlines. Jim Collins, in his very newest book, which just came out last week, was called Great by Choice, featured Southwest as one of only 7 organizations that went through an extensive research series of screens. They did 11 screens of 20,000 companies and ended up with 7 that they consider to be highly outstanding examples of very powerful companies. And this was one of the 7. Heskett, in the Culture Cycle book I just quoted from earlier, also identified Southwest Airlines as one of the top companies. In fact, if you have invested $10,000, boy, if we could only see this in retrospect, if we'd have invested $10,000 in 1972, by 2002, 30 years later, it would have been worth $12 million. That's a 63 times return on investment over the past, over that 30-year period, which puts them number 1 in return on investment of the Standard & Poor's index. So pretty powerful company. But here I think is a nice way to frame our discussion and to talk about culture. The founder, one of the co-founders of the company, Herb Kelleher, says it's those intangibles that are the hardest things for customers to imitate. Lots of organizations have tried to imitate and are imitating Southwest, but it's those intangibles. And he goes on to say it is that esprit de corps, that culture, the spirit that truly is our most competitive asset. So let's look at the hard evidence for some of those soft views. And we go back to about 20 years ago now. John Cotter and James Heskett wrote a book called Corporate Culture and Performance, which was based on a bit of research they did that stretched over a 10, 15-year period. They started out saying, well, what is it that do strong cultures make for high performance? And they basically found that, yes, they do, but they also make for low performance. Strong cultures can cut either way. So that stumped them at first. And then they went deeper and said, okay, what is it about strong cultures? How can we cut this further and understand what makes for high performance in a strong culture and what makes for low performance in a strong culture? And what they identified was that an unadaptive strong culture, which it makes for low performance, as we'll see in the numbers in a moment. So this is where managers mostly care about themselves, their work group, or the product or service. They're in love with the products or service they sell, and they're really trying to reduce risk. And management, processes, systems, bureaucracy, etc., takes precedence over leadership behavior. Whereas adaptive cultures, they found, are at the other end of the spectrum and much more effective. Here, managers care and are able to balance these three key stakeholder groups of whom they're serving, their stockholders, and their employees. Some of the more recent research I've seen as well in a book called Good Company takes that even and adds a fourth element to it, which talks about the environment or the communities or the world that we're part of. So we're valuing people and processes. It's that balance of both people and processes, not giving into the tyranny of the or, it's either or, but being able to balance both of those that makes the major difference. So here's what the impact that had, they found, on performance. It was revenue growth, dramatic differences. Growth in employment was obviously quite substantially different. Stock price growth was much higher in adaptive organizations, and net income growth was multitudes higher in high-performing organizations. So they concluded that book with saying that obviously it has a significant impact on a firm's economic performance, and that strong cultures are not rare, and they can cut either way. They can either reduce performance or they can improve performance. And that in the coming years, and how true it turned out to be since they've written that book, it's becoming an even more powerful factor. And here's the really key part, I think, of all of this, the last point, to say that cultures can be very difficult to change, but they can be made more performance enhancing. And that's certainly been our experience. We've now had dozens of examples over the last 30 years of organizations that have very successfully transformed and boosted their culture. Unfortunately, we've also seen examples that have gone the other way. So when we look at it, now here's a more modern take. This is more up-to-date. James Heskett, one of the co-authors of what we just looked at in this very newest book of his, has taken another whole look at this in today's world, and has said that the studies that he has done show that almost half of the difference in operating profit between organizations is attributed to culture, and that it provides a significant competitive advantage, especially in the difficult kinds of times that we're in right now, and it has no capital or very little investment with an infinite ROI. Well, that's the most powerful thing about this. Go back to Herb Kelleher's point. Now, everybody else in the airline business can invest money and buy equipment and all sorts of things and make big, huge capital investments. But it's the time and energy and focus we put into building our culture that makes the big difference. So we go on to the flip side of this, how we cut the other way, how strong ineffective cultures or unadaptive cultures can really block performance. It's estimated that 20% of people's time in an organization is wasted on corporate culture. And this is in strong, ineffective cultures. And he goes on to conclude that one of the authors of this study found that we can gain as much as 1 or 2 hours of productive work per employee per day. So if you think about it in your own organization, how much time do people spend doing things because that's the way we always did things, or continuing to fill out those forms or follow those procedures or provide those products or services, even though they may not really be needed anymore, or our customers may not even care about them anymore. So those are examples of ways that strong cultural habits can move into an organization, and as somebody once said, they can put us into a rut, and a rut was once described as a grave with a grave. Well, basically, it's a rut is a grave with the ends knocked out, and we can end up burying ourselves. Well, one of the books that came out this summer was from the McKinsey organization and called Beyond Performance. It's a book that I'm especially excited about because it does provide some really hard evidence, powerful evidence for these soft skills. And you can see the size of the study that they did here. It's a massive study. It's 600,000 respondents, 500 organizations, 6,800 CEOs and executives, and they also reviewed 900 books and articles from academic journals. I believe the whole thing took about 10 years of study and work, and it really is, as far as I know, one of the very biggest efforts of this sort that's been done today, and it's gleaned all kinds of great data and deep insights to what it takes to change culture. And I'm going to draw from this as we go along and look at some of these key points. But here's some of what they found is that there is much higher returns on investment, growth, and returns on net income to sales from strong, high-performing organizations. Now, they talk about healthy organizations is really another way of saying the culture of the organization, so their organizational health. And again, they find there's about a 50% variance there explained by the health of the organization. So here's part of the upshot of all of this, to say, all right, cultures make a huge difference. Cultures have a dramatic impact, positively or negatively, on organization performance. And every organization, every team, every group of people, every family has a culture. The key questions are, what is your culture? Do you know what your culture is? How do you know what it is? Or do you just think, or do you have some sense of what you think it ought to be, especially if you're in a leadership role? And is it by design? Have you designed your culture, or has it happened by default? So as we look at ways that culture gets woven into organizational initiatives and organizational work, what we see, again, is that it boosts or blocks lots of different initiatives, and we see this time and time again. It may be a major organizational changes like new technologies or IT sorts of systems, or restructuring the organization, or moving from centralization to decentralization, and all of those sorts of changes. It's a big part of customer service. It's key elements of quality and PQM and what's called Lean now, Six Sigma. There's all different variations of those sorts of programs around. Culture is a key element of it. It's part of any changes we try to make to boost productivity or efficiency. We've had a lot of work with a number of organizations, especially in the mining and energy sectors, around building healthy safety cultures. It's a key element of morale and engagement, and whether we're going to successfully be able to lift or boost those. It goes deep in determining the sorts of teams and teamwork and how people work together. And lately I've been doing a fair bit of work in the public sector again around the whole area of culture and how we can use cultural focus and cultural renewal to renew the public service. Okay, so hopefully I've reinforced for you that culture is critical. Every organization has a culture, and we need to be more consciously and clearly shaping our culture. So as we look at then many organizations that talk culture, we hear the word used a lot, talk leadership, talk change. What is it that trips up so many organizations? Well, let's first of all take a look at the problem. And the problem is that this is now decades of research. Hundreds of these studies have come out, and this article in Harvard Business Review was looking at some of that. The fact is that 70% they find of change initiatives fail. Now, we've seen that the number tends to be a little more like a half to two-thirds fail, so 50 to 70%. The flip side of that is that a half or two-thirds of these are succeeding. So I guess it depends a bit on your point of view, whether you see the glass as half full or half empty, or if you're into re-engineering, you might say, well, there's clearly twice as much glass here as is required. It's another way that you could look at this. So what trips our organizations up? Well, there's 5 here. I've put only this first one in rank order. The others could come in any kind of order, but this one's deliberately at the top of the list because the single biggest factor that determines the culture of the organization is the behavior of the people leading it, whether that's leading the division, leading the department, leading the team, or leading the entire organization, because culture exists at multiple levels. And so let's come back to this great big massive database and take a look at what they found. They found that when leaders model the changes you're trying to bring into the organization, it's 4 times more likely to be successful. 4 times more likely. And that when there's clarity about leadership competencies, so what are the skills, behaviors that we're expecting to see, that makes it 3.2 times more successful. And so they went on to say that 76% of CEOs and senior executives said that leadership development was important, but only 7% thought they were really doing it very effectively. And again, unfortunately, we find that so often to be the case. There's a lot of talk about leadership. There's a lot of good intentions about leadership. It's a great motherhood issue, but the actual doing it. Years ago in my previous company, the Achieve Group, we talked about knowing isn't doing, when theory's not enough, and we often aren't really doing it. So as we start to look then at the role of the senior team, it's absolutely vital. The culture really ripples out from the management team that's leading that organization. Again, whether it's a team, a department, an entire organization. And we have, for years now, found that you really can't build a team or an organization that's different from you. So if we want to look at how to change that team or change that organization, we have to look at changing what we're doing or saying or how we're behaving. Back to Cotter and Heskett, well, they say this is the single most important factor, is leadership at the top. Certainly, as Heskett then reviewed this more recently, he's once again saying that leadership is absolutely critical. This is one area where you can't delegate this to shape and maintain the culture. It needs hands-on leadership. We'll come back in a little while to talk about the emotional intelligence research, but one of the leaders in that field, Daniel Goleman, is saying the same kind of thing, that 50 to 70% of how employees perceive their organization's climate or culture is traced back to the leader. The boss creates those conditions. So it may be my immediate boss or it may be the big boss, but they're all connected together. So as we look then at the behaviors all the way up the organization, we've built this, we call it our commitment continuum. And this continuum is to say, well, are you committed to lean? Are you committed to customer service? Are you committed to this change, to the restructuring? Of course, most people say, sure, I'm committed, and here's some money. Go ahead, make this happen. Well, that's one level of commitment. Another level of commitment is where I, at least more assertively now, talk about the importance of this culture, the importance of teamwork, the importance of engagement, the importance of customer service. Maybe I even crank up the passion a little more and talk about how you all need to be improving customer service and teamwork and working engagement and so forth. But of course, what's missing from this picture is the level where it really starts to be delineated, involved leadership. If I keep behaving the same way, but talking how everybody else needs to change, it's going to fall off pretty quickly. If I start to behave in new ways and really clarify and identify what are the behaviors we need to change in order to drive this culture forward, then we can get to the final level of integration. We're going to come back to this theme, but this is clearly a key element and the number one issue in the failure factors. Second one, and of course all of these start to link together, but is this disconnect where we have all of these programs and pieces and things going on all around the organization. Many of them are excellent. Peter Drucker once described a champion as a monomaniac with a mission. And so you got lots of champions in here who are pushing forward on these initiatives, and many of them are great initiatives, wonderful tools. Sometimes those champions are a bit like Maslow. They're running around banging on the nail that they're most excited about, and missing the bigger picture, missing how all of this fits together. So we've come to call this bolting on change versus building it into the way we operate the organization. So bolting on is where it's an extra program, we're dumping information out there, we've done our values thing, we've got our vision, we've done all that stuff, we can check off all those boxes, but there's not really, it hasn't really taken. There's a high snicker factor. And we're using measurement and performance management and so forth, but using it often in fairly punitive ways. Whereas building it in means it's part of how we run the organization. We're having conversations. We're using values in active ways to guide our hiring, our promotion, our recognition, day-to-day behaviors. We're getting deeper into root causes and looking at systemic kinds of issues. We're using feedback not as gotchas or sticks to beat people up with. One way to send chills up the spine in most people in the organization is to say, I'd like to give you a little feedback. Well, we're using feedback as a way to learn collectively. It's part of our culture. We seek it. We look for it. We use it to grow and develop ourselves. So a third failure factor is assessment, where we really don't have a good handle on the kind of culture we have or what's working or not working in our current processes and people, both sides of that equation. If we come back to McKinsey's findings, they're saying that, and look at this number, 6.6 times more likely to succeed where there's good assessment. And we really understand the reality. Of course, managers oftentimes, when they're being faced with cultures that maybe aren't what they would want, to say, well, that's not reality. They don't understand the reality of the situation. Well, if we really look that reality in the face and get reality by way of good hard assessment, it can make a huge difference. And it's that kind of slowing down that allows us to really lay groundwork for good, successful implementation. So in our experiences, and you'll see a build on this a little bit later, we look at this from three perspectives. There is the technical or technology or expertise of what we do. This framework of ours has been around for a long, long time. One of my earlier books is built around it. And then we get into how we do it, so the way we organize the processes and approaches and methodologies that we use. And then the base of this triangle are the people elements, the leadership elements, the soft elements that start with the customer and work their way back in through the organization. So it's the balancing or bringing together of the hands, the head, and the heart. Well, if we break that down even a little bit further, we can say, well, management, the head, is all about thinking and analysis and planning and controls. This is where things like lean and efficiency and productivity would come into play. And it's all critical. It's vital that we have a good handle on this. Leadership, the soft skills, is about feelings and perceptions and how and energy levels and values and vision and true conversations rather than one-way email dumps. And so, again, when we come back and look at what McKinsey found from all of their work is when they looked at why a lot of change efforts weren't working, they said, well, you can point to more of the what's happening either outside the organization or the processes and systems side of thing. About a third of that would account for this. But in their research, 70% of the failures are negative employee attitudes and unproductive management behavior, which is the soft stuff. Absolutely vital and so often overlooked. An example of that is what we call it moose on the table or courageous conversations, where we're not spending the time. One of my previous books actually is of this title. It's my only work of fiction that looks at how easy it is and how often we avoid those really difficult conversations, and we don't have the courageous conversations and face the bull that's floating around our meeting rooms perhaps, or having those difficult conversations to address things that, like elephant in the room, 800-pound gorilla, In Australia, we call this kangaroo on the table, or in the Middle East where we've worked, it's camel on the table, so kangaroo or camel on the table or whatever, but it's just not dealing with the issues. That's a cultural issue. So we go on to look at then a fourth failure factor is not building a cause. We often hear about a case for change, but a cause for change, which is the heart. The case for change is the head. The cause for change is the heart. Really connecting at the heart level and the capacity for that change. Once again, the McKinsey research shows that getting employees connected and feeling involved and engaged and empowered is very important. 4 to 5 times more likelihood of success when we do that well. We get them engaged and energized. And so for us, it's bringing forward this idea that leadership is an action, not a position, making that something that's felt throughout the entire organization. You might be in a leadership role or have a leadership title, but if you aren't truly leading in the ways that we're going to talk about in a moment here, you may not be a leader at all. On the other hand, you've got people who aren't in formal leadership roles who are oftentimes outstanding leaders because they make it happen. So the subtext of this is, if it is to be, it's up to me. So I've been using for years now, and if you're familiar with some of my earlier work, you'll know that I've been using a model that came out of originally out of the healthcare field years ago, talked about being navigator, survivor, or victim. Well, in my latest book, Growing at the Speed of Change, I've really moved that more to think about modes of behavior rather than labels that could sound fairly permanent, whether you're a navigator, a survivor, or a victim. And so lead, follow, or wallow is, I think, the basic choices we have when dealing with change in life and certainly in our organization. So most people in an organization, as they're dealing with a change, will sit back and wait to see what happens. Now, hopefully they're sitting back and being maybe skeptical. That could be healthy, but at least being hopeful. I'm not sure where this is going. I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt. Let's see how this plays out. The dangerous part is slipping back into cynicism. Oh, here we go again. Oh, forget about it. Oh, there's no way. Why even bother? Don't even try. Don't go there. And so as we look at the two ends of a spectrum or a scale here, this, for us, really defines well the culture of an organization or the microculture of a team, or takes us right down to the glasses we put on personally and how we look at things. So if we're leading at the very top end of the scale, we would be essentially saying, how can we turn this into a positive? The lemons and the lemonade idea. So it's a mindset, an ethic, a way of trying to figure out how to take this bad situation or this big setback or this massive change that's just been thrust upon us that we may not like very much or even hate. What can we do to turn that into something positive? The dangerous territory is where we slide down into wallowing territory, where there's lots of conspiracy theories. They are out to get us again. And, of course, it's always interesting to push on who is they and the we-they gaps that exist. But here's the really dangerous culture. This is the culture where people are disengaged, where people are bitter, angry, cynical. This is the culture when we do a lot of these workshops with frontline teams or with any groups across the organization. We talk about the dangers of being in pity city. Far too often we can end up in pity city, driving the good old bitter bus down helpless highway, past whining way, pessimism place, dead end drive, all the way through Frown Town into Pity City. In our family, those would be called some dad jokes, where there's no hope. They'll never go for it. We tried that once. Forget about it. There's no point. So it's all a dead end. We may as well just stop trying. Well, unfortunately, those kinds of pessimistic viewpoints are way too common, especially in times of difficult change as we're living through right now. And so when we start looking at culture, we need to peel back further and say, well, is this a culture driven by fear or by courageous leadership, courageous conversations? Are we focused on punitive approaches and finding out what's wrong and catching people doing things wrong, or looking for what's going right? Are we being defensive and trying not to lose, or are we playing to win? Are we focusing on gaps and weaknesses, or are we trying to build on strengths? Do we see the worst and expect the worst in people, the old Theory X approach, or do we look for the best in people? The example I love of that, my favorite one, goes back years. I wrote about it in Growing the Distance. It's a little girl that's out riding in the car with her mother one day, and she says to her mother, "Mommy, where are all the stupid jerks and idiots today?" And her mother says, "Well, they only come out when your father's driving." Funny how that works. So what kind of culture is it that we're building here? And then lastly, do we have an infrastructure, a framework, a plan in place for cultural change? Or is it a lot of wishing and hoping and praying that things will work out? Do we have, for example, a culture that really sets good priorities? Well, here's one manager in an organization where we were talking to them about their culture change, and they were having a lot of trouble. And he said, well, we have these ongoing cycles of one thing after another. We seldom see anything through to completion. It seems to be a little bit of HBR, Harvard Business Review Management, or whatever the latest, hottest book is, and random brain impulse. And we seem to be like nervous water bugs with ADD that flip from one new program to another. Well, that's an example of not having a good, strong infrastructure, good, robust follow-through, and some real discipline in place to make this happen. And in fact, again, if we come back to the massive McKinsey study, they say that you're likely to be 6 times more successful if you've got a good structure in place with clarity of roles and responsibilities, steering teams, etc., that really will build the capacity for continuous improvement throughout the organization. So that's a good note on which to, I think, switch gears then and look at, so what does that look like? What are those kinds of infrastructures? What are those pathways? What are the elements that will help pull so much of this together? And it brings us back once again to the balancing of management and leadership. On the management side, the 85-15 rule has for decades now taught us that systems and processes make a huge difference. That when you look at errors and rework and customer service breakdowns, 85 to 95% of the time when you do root cause analysis, it is in the system, the process, or the structure. So it's not necessarily a motivation issue, an engagement issue, or that people aren't trying hard enough. We may have to look at the process or the structure. Peter Senge, in his earlier book on the fifth discipline, he's been in systems thinking for years, makes this point that when placed in the same system, people, however different they might be, tend to produce similar results. So that's the management side of the equation. The leadership side of the equation then is once again back to the soft skills, or if you're familiar with the work on emotional intelligence, we could say, well, management is about IQ, good thinking and planning and analysis, and using logic and really thinking it through. And leadership is about EQ, or emotional intelligence, EI, it's often called as well. And so one of the preeminent researchers on emotional intelligence is Daniel Goleman and his group. And this is one of his later books, I think it was about his 3rd or 4th book, where he talks about this link between performance and culture. And that's some of what we've certainly seen in the earlier slides as we looked at the impact of culture. Now, emotional intelligence, there's a website there on the screen, eiconsortium.org, which is their website. You can go and get a lot more information on this if you're not already familiar with emotional intelligence. But essentially, you can break it down into 2 major components. One component is personal, or the inner dimensions of leadership. And what I love about this research is it once again validates what for years we've been saying, that leadership is an inside job. We lead from the inside out. And so the outer part of this then is the connections we make with others, how we tune in or even care about where others are at, and how we then manage those relationships. Well, the impact of that kind of skill set is significant and highly relevant to our discussion about soft skills and culture. Because what was found, and what Goleman and his colleagues found in this particular study, where they were looking at almost 200 competency models around the world, they identified these 3 areas which fit wonderfully into that model, the triangle model we just looked at, the technical side, the management side, the leadership or emotional intelligence side, and they found that emotional intelligence is twice as important as all others across the organization, Now, that's, of course, assuming that you have the fundamentals of technology and management in place. Then emotional intelligence becomes twice as important. And nearly 90% of the difference with star performers in senior leadership roles was emotional intelligence. Significant impact. So we get into the look then at balancing, and this is a exercise that we do all the time with management teams or with individual leaders, managers, as they're going through leadership workshops, sitting back and reflecting on how much of my time do I currently spend with technical issues, solving technical problems, and management systems, processes, and analysis, and in leadership, the soft stuff, the emotional intelligence stuff, my own personal growth and development, coaching and developing and building the team or the culture of the organization. So is it a third, a third, a third? Is it 20, 20, 60? Is it the reverse? And then what do I think it ought to be? And every time I've done this study and I've done this exercise, I've done it hundreds of times over the years around the world, every single time I've yet to see an exception when I ask everyone to show of hands, how many feel you want to spend more time in the technical area? Very few hands go up. How many want to spend more time in management? A couple more hands might go up. How many want to spend more time in leadership? Almost the entire room puts up their hand. So why aren't we spending as much time leading as we'd like to? Starts to become the key issue. And that is a whole different topic on its own, but part of it is I think we are getting ourselves drawn into the day-to-day issues in the organization and day-to-day firefighting, or it may be skill issues, it may be a variety of things. But sometimes it's that we don't have good frameworks. We don't have good pathways to really understand the differences and map out how we get there. And so that's what we've tried to provide with what we call our compass model. It's a tip of the iceberg, I guess you could say, of pathways. If you go to our website and pull down the menu at the top of the website, it's under Jim Clemmer on our website, and then it says models and frameworks. You can get much deeper into this model. There are 16 pathways altogether. Clearly, I'm not going to go through all of those here, but I'll hit the high points and say that it starts with, we call it focus and context. You could call it lots of different things. It's been called vision, values, purpose, lots of things. I'll define some of this in a moment, but it starts there. Then we put in the North Star position very deliberately our customers, who we're serving, however you define that internally or externally, and the partners, those internal partners, so people on the front lines, those doing the real work, or external partners that you may have, and the way we build capacity in the organization, and how we help everybody understand and see the big picture, and how we develop the team and the organization. Well, those three major areas are leadership issues. So all that you see in burgundy is leadership. Now let's look at the management side of the equation. So it's how we set strategy and direction, how we establish goals and priorities, and the discipline we use for doing that. It's the measures and rewards that we put in place to make sure that we're measuring what really matters and that we're aligning and supporting and reinforcing the appropriate things that matter. And then processes and systems, are they helping or hindering? Are they getting in the way, or are they supporting us and moving us forward towards serving our customers and our partners and doing all of the rest of what you see on the slide? So these are the management factors. So to what extent are we balancing these two areas? Do we have a framework? Do we have a roadmap that helps us assess and establish priorities and begin our development process to move forward? So let me break some of this down a little bit more depth. Obviously, again, in a short overview like this, I can only touch the high points. So I talked a minute ago about focus and context, and it has three core elements to it. You see puzzle pieces here. Too often times we're all working away on our part of the jigsaw puzzle, putting pieces together, and maybe we don't all have the same box top in front of us. We're not all trying to build the same puzzle, and we end up with a lot of confusion. So you can call these things vision, values, purpose, mission, lots of different things. These three questions are the key questions. Now, I've been I've literally done hundreds of off-site executive retreats with executive management teams over the last 20, 30 years. And I've been in one-to-many vernacular engineering debates about, do we call this a mission or a vision, or and we get into all this debate, when what we really ought to be focused on is what are the behaviors that we need to be driving forward, and defining those in great detail and clarity. We've been doing a lot of that work lately with a number of clients to help define what behaviors at the executive level, the management level, the supervisory level, the frontline level, even at the board levels of organizations. What are the behaviors that link around our values and the kind of culture that we're trying to build? And are we then true northing ourselves with, and this is the only deliberate position on the compass that we put in this position at the north of the compass, that we use this to tune into where our customers are at. So the customer partner chain says, well, let's start with understanding our customer requirements, customer needs, what they're looking for. And external means external to our team or group, could be still internal in the organization. And it may be, now this is particularly true with a large organization where you're looking at an outside customer outside the organization. They may have partners, agencies, others that they work with that is also serving the customer. And as we move back through the organization, who the customer sees, their line of sight begins to diminish the further back the organization we go. And certainly by the time you get to external suppliers, it's disappeared. But many times support groups, IT, HR, other support groups will be far back and down in this picture. So part of the challenge here is, are we focused on meeting our customer needs? Do we know what those needs are? Do we know where the gaps are? And how do we then link every single person in the chain to those gaps and understanding how they connect? It also raises for us the point of serving the servers. Have we built a culture? Because if customer service is something we care about, and most organizations say they do, have we built a culture then that is serving the servers? Let's come back again to how Herb Kelleher at Southwest puts it. He says, my mother taught me that if your employees come first. In fact, they talk about how the customer comes second. Now, they're one of the most highly rated customer organizations in the world. But for them, the employee comes first. Look after them, and they will look after your customers. And, of course, that will keep your shareholders happy, too. So these days, there's a lot of talk about engagement. I just came across recently this study from Towers Watson on engagement that I think really fleshes this out a lot further. And it's a fairly extensive study of engagement practices around the world and what makes for the best kinds of engagement. And so they've identified 3 factors that need to come together for engagement. You need to also enable, which of course we found, and I've been saying for years, that empowerment or engagement without enablement is really abdication. And so we need to enable and we need to energize. And so they found where you've got all 3 of those, the companies in their study had operating margins 3 times higher and nearly 2 times higher if you have at least 2 of those. Well, let's go on to look at strategy and direction, which it brings us back again to the issue of how we set priorities. An excellent article here in Harvard Business Review talked to, again, some more studies, some more hard evidence of these soft skills, the soft skill of discipline, the soft skill of setting priorities, of stop doing lists, of pruning, of getting rid of things that we don't need to be doing anymore, which many cultures do not have built in. And so they contrasted cultures that do have discipline built in with those that don't, and found tremendous differences here. That companies that were fully trapped had employees feeling highly trapped, had people feeling like they're working under constant pressure. And look at the difference, 80% versus 4% in much more disciplined, highly effective organizations. Priorities constantly changing, 75 versus 1%. And so the respondents feeling like there's really no light at the end of this tunnel and feeling completely trapped. So this brings us back to, do we have systems and discipline for establishing 3 to 5 key imperatives, for who owns those across the team, the organization, how we develop measurements around them, cascade and involve everyone, and have real disciplined follow-through and follow-up. Something that's pathetically done, I must say, in many organizations is really following through. Well, to touch another bit of this is to go on and look at the areas of measures and rewards. So what are we measuring? What gets measured gets managed. Are we measuring, do we have a good mixture of leading and lagging indicators? Are we measuring the soft things that will tell us ultimately in the long term whether we're going to be effective with our customers or our overall goals? And it links us into as well the next area of looking at our processes and systems. So to what extent do we measure, for example, what's really important in our processes? To what extent are we managing our processes at a strategic level versus at tactical levels? Much process management that goes on these days, and the failure rate is still around 50 to 70% for a lot of process improvement activities. A lot of it is because the process improvement work is happening at the work face levels or the work team levels, and they sub-optimize each other. So one team up the line makes a change, which makes it twice as hard for another team down the line, but we don't have a good handle on that. Some organizations have done more work across functions, but it's the rare organization that really works across the entire unit and looks at the flow of their 3 or 4 major processes, because just about every organization can ultimately be boiled down to 3 or 4 major processes. Well, to complete our whirlwind tour here, I think of this as the city bus tour, where we're touring around a big city that we're visiting for the first time, and we're jumping on and off the bus quickly, and we'd love to spend more time in one spot, and you're welcome to come back to our website and do that. So the area of learning and development is a large area that covers a lot of ground. It's how we energize, involve, educate. It's how we build capacity in the organization. And it's how we mobilize people throughout the organization. I'm bringing us back to this quote that I showed you earlier, that mobilization is so critical. I'll bring us back as well to the lead, follow, wallow discussion, building an organization of leaders, because leadership is an action, not a position. Building an organization of partnering and partnerships, a culture where we all work together because we care and want to be effective together. It's an organization where we are balancing more effectively information and communications. Way too many organizations dump information, send out, the worst case examples would be introducing change by email or massive dump kinds of programs without really engaging and connecting and talking and having conversations that will help to move all of this forward. And then, of course, I'll bring us back to the issue of the kind of structures that we put in place and the kinds of roles and responsibilities with the infrastructure that rolls all of this out. And in our experience with successful culture change, this is an absolutely critical element that doesn't get nearly enough attention. Well, as we start to wrap up here and look at what are then the ways of pulling all of this together. So I've covered lots of territory. I've talked about the various problems and some of the steps to getting there and the pathways that will take us there. So here's where it gets a little difficult to generalize, because every organization we work with is somewhat different and has sometimes very big differences. But here's what I would generalize as the major steps. Some kind of assessment, some kind of looking at readiness for change in the organization. Where are we at now? What kind of culture do we have? Again, we'll come back and look at just how important that is to have some of that kind of information and that kind of assessment. Then to have a framework against which we're doing those assessments so that we've got a model and some best practices that we can assess against and that we can put our plan towards. Now, Drucker said, we all want to make other people effective. And just about every leader, manager, supervisor, executive wants to help others be more effective. But the real place to start is how do I make myself more effective? Or in the case of culture change, the executive team. How do we help the executive team be more effective in leading the culture change? So we are huge believers and practitioners of executive retreats and off-site sessions, usually 2 or 3 days. Take the executive team away, and maybe we review what assessment's already been done, or we start doing some assessment there. Again, the order of some of this can shift around a little bit. We get into a fair bit of education and understanding and awareness of what's all needed here and where we're going with all of this. We then set or reset, we call them strategic imperatives, 3 or 4 major initiatives, major focal points, and who's going to be in charge of those, putting in place that infrastructure and that framework. And then coming out of that retreat and having established some of those next steps in the framework and what's going to be happening, then beginning to take a look at, so where are we now? Part of this might have happened during the assessment phase in step 1, but generally it gets much deeper here in step 3, and then step 4, putting the plan together. So steps 3 and 4 often take quite a bit of work, depending on the size of the organization and the complexity involved. It could take months worth of work here of going back and forth and coming back to the executive, of having team leaders for each one of the major initiatives, pulling together their team plans, putting timelines in place, and then going ahead and implementing. And of course, implementing could be 6 to 12 months worth of hard work of implementation. But during that process, we need to have good discipline monitoring and follow-up. It might be monthly reviews, monthly or quarterly meetings at minimum, where we're coming back and we're reviewing and looking at where we are on track to this whole process. So at risk of oversimplifying what can be quite a complex in some cases, or just in other cases, there's a wide variety of where organizations are at. Some have done some of these pieces already and need to be built upon. Others have not done as much. Lots have had bits and pieces in place. And so how we bring all of that together is quite unique for each organization. Well, we're on our last slide. I can hear the cheers go up now. We've gone through a lot here in our last hour or so, and covered lots of territory in this drink from a fire hose. So where can we go from here? What are the next steps? Well, we are going to do another webinar. Now, I call this a webcast because it really is a broadcast one way, but the session we're going to make more interactive and make it more of a webinar or seminar or a little bit more of a workshop. And if at the end of this session, you'll be asked to complete a survey, and if you put your email address in that survey, then that will register you for the webinar. I will be following up as well with an email next week that will have links to the recording today, which we have archived or will be archiving, and it will have links to a number of articles, models, a lot of the material that I've touched on, and some video links as well, where you can get some video examples or where I'm presenting some of this material. So you can pick and choose the areas that perhaps you'd like to go back and spend more time in our city tour here. Or if any of this has triggered some interest in talking further about your own situation, your own organization, and you'd like to have a consultation on the phone or send me an email, we can set something up. I'm very happy to chat with you further about your own situation, whether it's leadership development workshops or whether it's looking at the culture issue on a larger scale, and how we might be able to help you with that. We'd be delighted to do so. Well, there we are. I think we're pretty much right on time. The Whirlwind Tour, the city tour, when my wife Heather and I go off to new cities, and we love to travel internationally, one of the first things we do is take the city bus tour, go around, take the highlights of the city, and then decide where we want to go and spend more time. So we've just put you on one of those whirlwind bus tours around the city. Hopefully you've seen a few sites, you've enjoyed, you've picked up some ideas, thoughts, maybe some things that you take away from here immediately. and now you may want to spend some more time going back in depth. So we'll be hearing back from me with an email for everybody who is registered for this, and we'll point out some areas that you can go back and get much deeper. So thank you very much.